committee will reconvene. After our last order of business, we stand ready to entertain additional amendments. Do we have any additional? The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I have two amendments, but this would be amendment number 7 on your list. 046, I think that is?
046.
Okay.
Amendment to H.R. 3813, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be...
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is fairly straightforward and reasonable, I think, in that it would prevent the main provisions of the amendment in the nature of a substitute from going into effect while federal employees are operating under a pay freeze. Right now, we have, according to the Consumer Price Index, we've got inflation running at about 3.6%. We're in a pay freeze. It looks like there will be a continued pay freeze. So the effect of Mr. Ross's bill would actually reduce the value of the pay being received by federal employees in the first place. It looks like it's going to the pay freeze is going to remain in effect. Other sections of the bill would actually take more of the take-home pay away from federal employees and dedicate that towards their pensions. So you'd have a prolonged period of declining pay for federal employees, for our dedicated public servants, who many of them, like other middle-income Americans, are struggling to pay for increased health care costs, food, gas, and education costs. So coupled with the pay freeze, this legislation will cause a double hit to employees' paychecks, resulting in a serious hardship for federal workers. It would put at risk their ability to pay their bills and to prepare for an adequate retirement. For example, current employees who retire at age 55 after 30 years of service would be subject to a loss of at least $77,000 over the next 10 years. That's just the next 10 years. Mr. Chairman, it serves no one to attack federal workers' livelihoods and retirement security, because the American public will end up losing if the federal government cannot recruit the best qualified individuals to serve. So I think we need to recall that our federal employees have already made a significant sacrifice by accepting a 2-year pay freeze, and that looks like it's going to go ahead in perpetuity for some time, and that decision will bring savings to the government of over $60 billion over the next 10 years. So even before this current pay freeze is scheduled to end, some members of Congress are trying to extend the pay freeze for another year through 2013. In fact, the House just passed such a bill last week, which I and many of my Democratic colleagues on this committee opposed. In addition, many agencies are already offering retirement buyouts and considering furloughs and layoffs in order to deal with the budget cuts mandated by the Budget Control Act. So it's unfortunate that we arrive at this disagreement, and some think it's inappropriate, some think it's appropriate to continue to come back again and again to our middle-income federal workers, the vast majority of whom make less than $75,000 a year, to try to squeeze more money out of those individuals while adamantly refusing to ask millionaires and billionaires to pay one dime more. It would be unfair and inconsiderable, I think, to require federal employees to pay for more of their retirement benefits while simultaneously working under a pay freeze. And while I oppose the substitute amendment, if we are to require increased contributions from our federal workers, it should not be required that those payments be made while we have already instituted a pay freeze, and that pay freeze is in effect. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to vote to adopt this amendment, and I thank the chairman for his time. I yield back. I yield to the ranking member.
Which would prohibit this bill from taking effect while federal employees are operating under a pay freeze. H.R. 3813 would reduce pay and benefits from middle-class American workers by taking money out of their pockets and forcing them to contribute more for their retirement. Federal employees are not responsible for the deficit, yet they have been called upon again and again to help reduce it. Where does it end? In this case, the legislation is silent on how the savings will be used. It appears that federal employees are being asked to give up their money to create a piggy bank so House Republicans can pay for other priorities. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is necessary because Federal employees are already sacrificing in the name of deficit reduction. The current pay freeze, which will continue through 2012, has saved taxpayers $5 billion this year and will achieve $60 billion in savings over the next 10 years. Further, Federal employees will likely be subject to layoffs and furloughs as part of the Budget Control Act passed in August. In fact, legislation was passed by the House just last week that would extend the pay freeze through 2013. I do not believe we should reduce the take-home pay of middle-class American workers at the same time we are freezing their pay. We do not need to add insult to injury. If we are going to require Federal employees to contribute more to their retirement, we should not do so while freezing their pay. For that reason, I urge members to adopt this amendment so Federal employees do not have to endure yet another insult on their pay and benefits. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak in opposition to the amendment. You know, nowhere else but Washington, D.C. can a pay freeze result in a 3% increase in your salary. And that's what's happened under the pay freeze that's currently operating and the pay freeze which was just adopted on the floor overwhelmingly by more than two-thirds of the members last Tuesday. Federal employees are still eligible for a 3% step increase despite the pay freeze. That equates to about $1,303 annually increase average per employee. But what does it take to receive that? Well, history will show that 99.9% of the people eligible for a step increase in the Federal workforce received that last year. And if we're asking under this bill to contribute an additional 0.5% to your pension, and you're going to get a 3% increase anyway, then you're really getting a 2.5% increase in your salary despite the fact that there is a pay freeze. So it seems to me that we are asking the Federal workforce to do no more than what we're asking the American public to do. And I submit that even under this bill, the Federal workforce has a 99.9% chance of receiving an annual pay increase under the step pay increases, and I would urge opposition.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
I want to support the gentleman's position that those receiving real pay increases that occur, certainly should not be waived on this requirement to begin the new program. I would also join with the gentleman from Massachusetts in saying that I would like this committee from now through whenever this takes effect to make sure that we look specifically at whether or not there are some individuals who will receive 0, 0, 0 net increases other than members of Congress that we may want to look at to make sure that there is a question of should someone have a 0.5% true reduction, whether it's for their own pension or not, at a time in which there is some inflation. So this is one of those situations in which I'll be voting with the gentleman from Florida, but I will tell the gentleman from Massachusetts that I've instructed our staff to begin looking at what that impact is and how the committee could both score and make sure that there is a provision in final law to ensure that there not be a reduction in net pay to a current worker. I think, as Mr. Connolly said earlier on, there is a bargain, and I'd like to make sure that this committee looks into that. So although this particular amendment in its current form I won't be able to support, I do strongly recommend that the committee on a bipartisan basis get the facts right and reconvene on that narrow portion. And I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Speak recognition.
The gentleman from Massachusetts would like you to yield to him for just a moment.
Yeah. I thank the chairman. I just want to correct what has been said here. I know that that has been thrown out here a lot, saying that Federal employees all receive step increases even though their pay is frozen. But that is not correct. Under the current GS pay system, you have to realize that two-thirds of Federal employees are not eligible for step increases year to year. The way it works, for example, in fact, annual within-grade step increases only occur for those employees who are moving within steps 1 through 4. In fiscal year 2011, about 35% of all Federal employees in the GS system were in one-year waiting periods. Those are the people that you're talking about, the people that within the one-year period they may receive a step increase. However, under current law, employees within GS steps 4 through 7, they have a 2-year waiting period. So they're not eligible for a step increases while they're in that 2-year waiting period. In fiscal year 2011, 26% of all Federal employees in the GS system were in 2-year waiting periods. Now, employees moving within steps 7 through 10, that's the different level of the GS pay system, they have to wait 3 years. 3 years before they're eligible to receive any in-step pay increases. So under some of the legislative measures promoted by my friends on the other side of the aisle, there will be most likely be a significant number of dedicated Federal employees that won't receive any pay adjustment for over 3 years on top of the freeze that we already have in place. So that might be a 5-year pay freeze for those employees, despite inflation being over 3%. So this really means a pay freeze for these employees. This is not saying, oh, they're not going to get this pay freeze, but they're going to get step increases. So, and finally, 16% of all Federal employees in the GS system are at step 10. That's 16% of all employees. People at step 10 do not get step increases ever. They are completely banned. So there's no waiting period. They just don't get any pay increases, step increases. Those tend to be the people we talked about earlier, the researchers over at NIH, the doctors at the VA, the folks that are regulating Wall Street, attorneys who are working on derivatives law, the folks that we depend on who are extremely high skilled. So they get 0 because they're in step 10. They've already reached the maximum. They do not get step increases. So while there are many things that the gentleman from Florida and I agree on, this is not one of them. And I think he has to just drill down a little bit more on the GS pay system, and I think he'll see that this is not a situation. We're not doing an end around here. These folks are really under the freeze, and you know, I think this amendment would really help them if we allowed it to go forward. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Florida yields back. If there are no further members seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman, Mr. Lynch. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? The gentleman who requests a roll call pursuant to the earlier announcement, all votes are being rolled, so we'll take it in about 15 minutes, hopefully. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, seeks recognition for an amendment. The clerk will read the amendment. You
have 2 at the desk, if you can identify them.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You have 2 amendments at the desk.
Oh, it's the one striking Section 4. And the other one, I'm not going to offer.
Okay. An amendment to H.R. 3813 offered by Mr. Davis of Illinois. Strike Section 4 of the bill.
The amendment will be considered as read, or I guess it was completely read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment strikes Section 4 of the bill. That will eliminate the annuity supplement for Federal employees who retire before they are eligible for Social Security. The amendment would preserve the first Social Security annuity supplemental payment. Based upon current law, the first supplement is only payable until age 62, and only to those retiring at the minimum retirement age with 30 years of service or at age 60 with 20 years of service. And while we're all concerned about costs and budgets and deficits, we can't not remember and understand the many sacrifices that our Federal workers have made during the past several years. We have frozen their pay, their cost of living adjustments, and even salary increases. Several have begun to retire for a multitude of reasons, and clearly under the understanding that this is a promised benefit to collect. My office has received hundreds of calls and emails asking that we do not change the rules affecting their retirements. Like, for example, Thomas Bennett from Malton, New Jersey, who is an engineering specialist with the Internal Revenue Service. At 57 years of age and 35 years of service, he had planned to retire to care for his ailing wife, who was diagnosed with lymphoma. Now Mr. Bennett may be forced to work until 62 to collect Social Security. If this benefit is eliminated, missing quality, critical time to care for his wife. Mr. Chairman, 30 years is a long time to work anywhere and in any job. Eliminating this benefit is simply wrong and terribly unfair. Our workforce, our federal workforce, has always been ready, willing, and able to serve us and to serve the American people. I think that it is our duty to honor their service by holding to our commitments of this benefit. I hope that this benefit can, in fact, be retained so that those individuals who have given 30 years, who have actually worked for 30 years, who are not really asking for anything special, but simply asking to retain the benefit that they have been expecting. So I would urge passage of this amendment and yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, the amendment offered by Mr. Davis would strike H.R. 3813, the provisions that eliminate the annuity supplement for federal employees who retire before they are eligible for Social Security. Under current law, federal employees who retire before they become eligible for Social Security receive an annuity supplement. H.R. 3813 would eliminate the supplement for all federal employees except those subject to mandatory retirement. The National Treasury Employees Union indicates that the elimination of these supplements for the average employee eligible to retire at 55 will result in a loss of over $65,000 over 7 years. This is a huge sum for most middle-class American families. One of the most troubling aspects of this provision is that it goes back on the promise that millions of federal workers have relied on for decades. During a hearing before the Federal Workforce Subcommittee, the majority's own witness, Andrew Biggs, made exactly this point. He said this, and I quote, "Benefits already accrued should not be altered. Those benefits have been promised and earned, and the obligation to pay them should be honored." End of quote. I completely agree with Mr. Biggs, and this amendment will ensure that the federal government does not break that commitment to senior employees on the verge of retirement. Many federal employees have been working for up to 30 years with the expectation of receiving this payment. In fact, thousands of employees elected to switch out of CSRS into FERS based on the promised supplement payment. For example, Paul Stiles is a GS Grade 6 IRS examination technician from Omaha, Nebraska. He will be eligible to retire in May 2013 after 34 years of federal service. 34 years. If this bill passes, his FERS annuity supplement payment will be completely eliminated, throwing his retirement plans into chaos. Mr. Stiles asked, and I quote, "How can the rules be changed now after I've structured my financial retirement plan around these rules?" I believe we should honor employees who have dedicated their lives to federal service by allowing them to retire with dignity, presenting a federal employee with more than 30 years of federal service with a sudden unexpected gap of $65,000 in their retirement income is hardly dignified treatment. I strongly support this amendment, and I thank Mr. Davis for his leadership on this issue. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has now expired. We now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, the chairman of the subcommittee, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I would much rather be in a position where I could come before this committee and say we need increases because we have the money to provide those increases to our federal workforce. I think it's a much better position to be in, to be able to say, here, we want to make some more promises to you because we believe we can keep them in the future. But unfortunately, reality has reached us today, and we can no longer uphold the obligations or the deals that were allegedly made in this regard. It's interesting because right now, with this elimination, we will save the Federal Government $225 million a year, according to OPM. It will not affect those that are subject to mandatory retirement, such as law enforcement, firefighters, air traffic controllers. But more importantly is we have to really address the reality of what we can afford and what we cannot afford. And what I'm concerned about is not only my children, but my grandchildren will now have to work longer themselves to pay for the inequities and the overspending that this Congress has and continues to do. This is a difficult decision to make. It is not at all a swipe at anybody, at any Federal employee. There's no vilification going on here. The reality is we have to change the way we're doing business if we want to uphold our obligation to make sure we recruit and retain the best Federal workforce we possibly can. And therefore, Mr. Chairman, I would urge strong opposition to this amendment.
Would the gentleman from Florida yield?
Yes, sir.
You know, I'm listening to this debate, and I'm thinking about the employees at American Airlines. They're about to go through a traumatic experience. I mean, American Airlines has decided that they are going to walk away from their pension obligation of those who are collecting retirements now and future retirees. I mean, is that the message we are sending with this bill, Mr. Ross, to tell the Federal workers we're going to walk away from the obligation from what you signed up for years ago when you started your service with the Federal Government?
No, sir, not
and then, you know, the ranking member made a valid point, too, about, okay, we aren't designating this money for anything, and apparently we must be paying for the Bush tax cuts with the money that you say we're going to save.
If I could reclaim my time here, you know, we spend, what, over $440 billion a year in Federal payroll. We're going to continue to increase that, and we're going to continue to increase the amount that we fund for our pension obligations such that it's going to create an even greater burden. You know, when I was in the private sector and I started a business and I had to make ends meet, I didn't go out there and borrow more money because that would never have been able to continue to succeed in my business. And I didn't have the benefit of going out there and raising rates on my clients just because I knew they would pay that. No, I had to make cuts, and I had to make painful cuts. But the worst cut of all would have been to say, I'm sorry, you're terminated, I can't afford to keep you as an employee. But I could sit down with my employees and say, look, we've been through this, we'll get through this, but what I need you to do is to stay with me, because you're valuable to the organization, but we have to make some sacrifices. I'm asking the American public to make sacrifices. I'm asking the American worker to make sacrifices. The fact that we've spent four successive years of over $1 trillion in deficits, unprecedented in this country, and yet I have to go back to my constituency back home and say, oh, sorry, you're unemployed? At least I can go to the American worker, the Federal worker, and say, we've been able to keep your job, but we have to ask you to sacrifice to give in on some of the benefits.
If the gentleman would yield again.
I will yield back, yes, sir.
Mr. Rouse, I mean, look,
the gentleman
we have
yielding.
spent a decade of overspending and a deficit spending. But I don't know if you've noticed or not, but Federal workers are not the highest paid group of workers in this country, in our economy. And the retirement benefits are an incentive to keep them. We put a lot of money into training them, but we cannot pay them at the level that private industry can. And so I think that should be taken into consideration.
I appreciate that. And reclaiming my time, there's still a greater attrition rate in the private sector 4 times than there is with the Federal Government. I would just close by saying that making these changes today, we can afford good pensions in the future. And I yield back.
And they may be staying for the pension. Thank you.
I thank both of the gentlemen. If there's no further comment, the gentleman from Virginia seeks recognition on this amendment.
I do.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't use it all. I just am struck with the passion of our colleague from Florida about the need for sacrifice. And yet the idea that the Bush tax cuts in the upper income brackets should expire, that's a sacrifice too far. A millionaire's tax, a little surcharge on people who make more than $1 million a year, that's a little sacrifice to help underwrite the cost this country is incurring and help pay down the debt. That's a sacrifice too far. Any kind of transaction fee on successful Wall Street moguls or hedge funds, that would somehow choke off the recovery and would damage this economy. So I would just simply say, well, the passion behind the idea of sacrifice is certainly something notable and admirable. I wish we were consistent in applying sacrifice across the board, especially with those most equipped to incur such a sacrifice for their country. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If there is no further comment, the motion now occurs on the amendment from the gentleman from from Illinois. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the nays have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any? The gentleman from Illinois. A recorded vote of the amendment is offered. Mr. Davis will be postponed pursuant to committee rules. I now entertain additional amendments. The gentleman from Cleveland, Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose H.R. 3813, the security.
The gentleman is recognized for an amendment.
Thank you.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 3813 offered by Mr. Kucinich of Ohio, strike Section 3 of the bill.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose H.R. 3813, the Securing Annuities for Federal Employees Act. H.R. 3813 forces Federal employees to pay more into their pensions while taking significant cuts to their retirement benefits. And yet the Federal pension system is currently fully funded. Under this legislation, the 12,251 Federal employees in my congressional district, including postal workers, law enforcement, and firefighters, will be asked to take significant cuts to their retirement benefits. This legislation eliminates the Federal Employees Retirement System, or FERS, annuity supplement for employees that retire before they are eligible for Social Security. This unfair provision creates unnecessary hardship on Federal employees who have paid into FERS and Social Security on the promise that they could rely on both for income in their retirement. Simply put, H.R. 3813 places an unnecessary and disproportionate burden on middle-class Federal employees who are already enduring a 2-year pay freeze. H.R. 3813 will significantly affect new Federal employees. That is why I have offered an amendment to strike Section 3 of H.R. 3813. Section 3 creates a third-tier retirement system for new secure annuity employees, in which new Federal employees who have less than 5 years of previous Federal service will have to pay 4% of their wages into the Federal employees retirement system. This is in comparison to the current 0.8% that Federal workers currently pay, and on top of the 6.2% they will be paying into Social Security. H.R. 3813 also recalculates pensions for new employees based on their 5 highest years of salary rather than the current 3, and reduces the pension formula multiplier, resulting in an annuity worth that is approximately 40% less than is the case under existing law for new hires. If the Federal Government's goal is to hire and retain the nation's best and brightest, H.R. 3813 is the surest way to ensure they will look elsewhere for employment and retirement security. Rather than serve as an example of fair and equitable employment, the government will serve as an example of what not to do under H.R. 3813. These provisions ask new Federal employees to take cuts in their pay while guaranteeing that their pension incomes will be slashed. We should not be playing politics with the pensions of thousands of hardworking Federal employees who are dedicating their lives to public service. We're all committed to reducing the Federal deficit, but it must be done responsibly. H.R. 3813 fails to do that. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and to oppose this legislation. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair would announce that we have, after this amendment, only 2 additional amendments, one of which has been previously agreed to, or we anticipate a voice vote in favor. So I would caution all members not to go far. If we don't have everyone back, we'll try to be reasonable and go to other voice business. But ultimately, we'd like to conclude probably in the next 15 minutes. It looks like we're going much smoother than planned, and I thank you all for that. With that, we recognize the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Interesting to note that over 450,000 Federal employees make over $100,000 a year. We have the largest workforce we've ever had, 2.15 million Federal workers out there. We've seen a decrease significantly in private employments. Needless to say, these are tough times. Let's establish some factual parameters. Factual parameters are that we're not being able to meet our obligations as a Federal government and have to borrow. And that's not a good situation to be in. The other thing that I have to suggest about striking this particular provision that I'm against is that if you look at 29 states throughout this country that have changed their pension plans, they have required that their state employees contribute 5%. With this change, we're asking new employees, new members of Congress, after January 2013, to contribute 4% to their pension plan. It's a stretch for some, no question about it. But when you put it in relative terms to what other employees in governmental entities have to do and have done, I submit to you that it's more than reasonable and it's more than fair, and again would strongly recommend against this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment offered by Mr. Kucinich would strike from this bill those provisions that create a new pension system for new Federal employees. As written, H.R. 3813 would require new employees in the Federal Civil Service to contribute 4% of their salary to their pension plans. These new employees would still be contributing 6.2% of their salary to Social Security. Additionally, they would need to contribute 5% of their salary to their thrift savings plan to receive the full match. H.R. 3813, pensions for new employees, under H.R. 3813, pensions for new employees would be calculated on the basis of their 5 highest years of salary rather than the current high 3, and the formula multiplier used to calculate their benefits would be reduced. Even those in careers such as law enforcement, firefighting, and air traffic control would face a reduction in their pension calculation multiplier. This legislation would require new hires to pay significantly more than current employees pay to receive an annuity worth roughly 40% less than an annuity they would receive under existing law. H.R. 3813 would designate these new employees as, quote, secure annuity employees, end of quote. They should be more properly designated as the pay more, get less employees. The FERS system is fully funded, and implementing these provisions will yield no benefit to that system. As this legislation does not specify how the savings that would result from H.R. 3813 will be used, it is unclear why these cuts are even necessary. It appears as if the majority is using Federal employee pay and benefits as a piggy bank to fund unrelated initiatives. We've heard a lot of talk about what's happening in the private sector. The question becomes, are we in a race to the bottom? What is clear, however, is that the implementation of these provisions will cut take-home pay for new employees while giving them a reduced pension. These provisions are senseless and unnecessary. I thank Mr. Kucinich for his work on this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If there's no further debate, the question now arises on the amendment from the gentleman from Ohio. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman requests a recorded vote on the amendment offered by Mr. Kucinich will be postponed pursuant to the rules. Does anyone else have an amendment The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 3813 offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute would allow Federal and postal employees enrolled in either the Civil Service Retirement System or the Federal Retirement System to deposit unused annual vacation leave into their TSP accounts upon retirement. This change is consistent with the changes adopted by the IRS in 2009 for private sector 401k plans, and there is a long tradition of ensuring that the TSP is relatively reflective of what is allowed in similar private sector retirement plans. The amendment is based on a bipartisan bill that Congressman Chaffetz from Utah and I jointly introduced in the 111th session of Congress, and which was reported favorably out of this committee in April of 2010. I have often heard my colleagues talk about the importance of ensuring some degree of parity between private and public sector retirement plans, and I think this amendment would do that. The changes are fully supported by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. The amendment is necessary because it would allow our Federal workers allow the workers the chance to rebuild their TSP accounts to make up for the losses incurred from the financial crisis. In addition, if we're going to take more money out of the paychecks of our Federal employees, which it appears we're doing here, by increasing their retirement contributions and reducing their benefits, as the substitute amendment would do, then at the very least we should give our public servants the opportunity to make up for some of that loss by depositing their unused annual leave into their thrift savings plan accounts, which are, for the general public's edification, similar to 401ks. The Federal Government and our society will benefit if we do everything in our power to ensure that rather than undermine the ability of our dedicated Federal employees to retire with dignity, we improve their adequate retirement savings. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to vote to adopt this amendment, and I thank them.
Would the gentleman yield to the gentleman from Utah?
I would certainly do so at this time.
Thank you. I appreciate working with the gentleman from Massachusetts in offering this amendment jointly with him. I think this is good public policy. I also appreciate Chairman Issa and Chairman Ross for their support in this. The idea that we would encourage savings over the long period of time is something that we should be encouraging at every level. Certainly allowing and giving the opportunity for Federal employees to participate in this, I think, is, again, good public policy. And I appreciate the bipartisan manner in which we're offering this, and would encourage members on both sides of the aisle to support it. I think all of our Federal employees would appreciate it, would help them and encourage them for more savings. So again, I appreciate Mr. Lynch's attention on this, and I'm glad to join him in a bipartisan effort to offer this jointly.
Would the gentleman further yield?
Yeah, well, just briefly, I just want to say I thank the gentleman for his remarks and for his support, and I'm happy to be working with him. I'd like to yield at this time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. I strongly support the amendment offered by Representative Lynch, which would permit Federal employees to transfer lump sum payments received upon their retirement for any unused annual leave to their thrift savings plan accounts. Like 401k plans, TSP accounts have been severely hit by the global financial crisis. Many workers have seen their balances fall steeply. It is the tradition of our committee to ensure that this plan remains in step with private sector 401k plans to the extent possible. Legislation has previously been enacted that would enable lump sum payments to be made into 401k accounts. I believe that it is the primary intent of the gentleman from Massachusetts to ensure that the same change is made to the TSP system. That said, given the significant impact that the implementation of 3813 would have on the employees who have who or soon will be eligible to retire, this particular amendment may actually help to enhance the retirement security of those Federal workers who may face the loss of their FERS Social Security annuity supplement. I want to thank the gentleman for offering, and with that, I also want to thank the chairman and the ranking, the subcommittee chairman, for what I think is an agreement.
The gentleman from Massachusetts controls the time.
I have a half a minute left. I'd like to yield it to the gentlelady from Washington, D.C.
Would the gentleman yield back? The gentleman
yield
yields back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, I feel like saying, wow, at last this committee is going to do something good for federal employees. I mean, I think we ought to celebrate this amendment. This has been a period when there have been nothing but losses and criticism of federal employees. Of course, I've been on this committee ever since coming to Congress, and there's been nothing but criticism of federal employees all along. But this time, this criticism has come with real losses, and we've seen some of them today. This committee could, I regret that this amendment could not have been done earlier, but in a real sense, it could not come at a better time, because it comes at a time when we are shrinking the federal government, and the notion of depositing your annual leave instead of using it or taking it as a great big lump sum at a later period makes a lot of sense, and it's some good news for federal employees. I like very much the notion of promoting savings. We will recall that until this debacle began in 1980 with the failure of the economy, that one of the chief criticisms of the American people and of the way we conducted business was the scant savings that they had. It turns out that the only savings they had were chiefly in their homes, and for most of them, that is devalued or gone. So this, of course, promotes savings in a way that is most needed now, since there's been a shrinking of savings. There's been a shrinking of the federal government, so it promotes efficiency in the federal government, since people will not use up their annual leave so readily. So I want to thank Mr. Lynch and Mr. Chaffetz for, I suspect, ending this hearing with some good news for a change for federal employees.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Be glad to yield to the chairman.
I join with the gentlelady in saying that although these changes are difficult and they're not a good pill to swallow, that a degree of fairness in looking at something that Mr. Chaffetz had offered previously and Mr. Lynch is now offering now, and saying, well, when would we find the offsets to allow the federal workforce to enjoy some of the same benefits that we previously made available in the private sector? And so I couldn't think of a better time to make what is a small change to the bill, but I think meaningful in the sense that it can't always be just about taking. If we say we want to harmonize with the private sector, we need to be willing to harmonize on both sides of the ledger. So I thank the gentlelady for her kind comments and yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on this non-controversial amendment. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes definitely have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized to offer an amendment.
It's designated number 50.
The clerk will read the amendment. Is it the 30 or the?
Amendment to H.R. 3813, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment cuts to the chase. The majority clearly believes that people who earn more than $100,000 can afford additional cuts to their take-home pay, even though millionaires and billionaires cannot. This amendment says very simply that any federal employee who currently makes an annual salary of less than $30,000 are exempt from this legislation's cuts. The United States median household income is $52,000. The people covered by my amendment take home only a fraction of that amount. The cuts in this legislation would be substantial for those employees and their families, particularly if they are trying to make ends meet in an expensive area like Washington, D.C. There are millions of Americans suffering in this economy, including those who are working low-wage jobs. If you vote against the amendment, you're voting to impose further hardship on Americans with low-wage jobs just because they happen to be employed by the federal government. It would be senseless and, frankly, counterproductive for our national economy for this committee to reduce pay for those who earn the least. For that reason, I urge the committee to adopt this common sense amendment. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I'll recognize myself briefly. The amendment falls short of the recommendation in the President's Fiscal Commission report, also known as Simpson-Bowles, which called on all Federal employees to pay greater share of the nominal cost of their defined benefit plan. The amendment ignores the President's plan for economic growth and deficit reduction, called on all Federal employees to pay more to retain their defined benefits. Although I do recognize this is only 4% of the workforce, as the gentleman from Maryland knows, that is a different 4% during different portions of their career, and for that reason, I do oppose the amendment, but understand the gentleman's feeling that that 4% should, in fact, be sectioned out. So I will be opposing the amendment, encouraging my colleagues to do so. With that, I yield back. Good. If there is no further debate, the question now occurs on the Cummings amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. And with that, we have concluded all known amendments. I'm going to allow a small additional time for all members to gather. And with that, if I can get the right talking point, I'm going to suspend this markup and go to the other bills. Oh, hold on. The Chair would announce that upon completion of the other bills, including the postal, the intention is to go immediately to final. So, any staff that are here on either side, get your members here. I think we've given already enough notice. The committee will now consider H.R. 3902, the District of Columbia Special Election Reform Act. I recognize myself briefly for an opening statement. I want to commend the gentlelady from the district for her hard work in recognizing that current law falls short of the efficiencies necessary to prevent unnecessary costs to the District of Columbia. No one could be more aware that under the intent of the Home Rule Act, the D.C. Board of Elections generally must hold a special election to fill vacancies within the District of Columbia. And knowing that 114 days is more than is currently needed, we have worked with the gentlelady from the district and the City Council to come up with a modified lesser amount that will generally, by opening the window, allow for an orderly process combined with normal elections. I think this is particularly important not just for home rule in the proper sense, but with the fact that no one gains by artificially having more special elections in a city of nearly 500,000. Upon the passage of this act, we will begin having elections to fill vacancies occur whenever possible during an ordinary election already scheduled if it falls between 70 and 140 days after the vacancy is created. We believe this minimizes gamesmanship and any other inability of government to fill these slots, but does allow the City Council to make sensible decisions. It is supported, obviously, by its author and by the chairman and by Mayor Gray's administration, and I'm sure the residents of the District of Columbia. I'd like to thank Ms. Norton for her diligent work and for bringing this in time for today's markup, and I urge support for it and yield back. With that, I would recognize the ranking member, I guess, first for his comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go ahead and yield to Ms. Norton.
Well, I thank the ranking member for yielding and for his assistance on this bill. I want to thank you, Chairman Issa, for calling me and inviting me to be ready for today's markup when you learned of a recent a recent circumstance that we were all fearful of and that makes this bill even more urgent. It really has to do with such a minor problem that last time I brought it before us, I said I had to only apologize that a matter of such small moment had to come before any committee of the Congress of the United States. And you, Mr. Chairman, spoke up and said you agreed that this is not the kind of thing that the committee ought to have to devote its time to. But these matters, structural matters, and procedural matters like this end up in the so-called charter of the District of Columbia, because the District of Columbia amazingly granted home rule, the right to govern itself, only in 1974. That happened through a document called the Charter. And so that charter happened here in the Congress. So when you want to change that charter, you got to come to the Congress. I'll speak a moment about why I think that is something that I think we can work on. Now, the district, of course, approves these things themselves, except that doesn't get them anywhere. They've got to come to me to introduce a bill. I do want to point up why we want to make it possible for matters like this not to have to come to the Congress, because this is an actual instance where a minor, almost ministerial change did not occur, not because of what happened to this committee, if I may say so, Mr. Chairman. This committee immediately saw that this is a matter that was no emergency then. This is a matter that should be dealt with. Let's pass this bill. We went to the Senate, and at the time they had these anonymous holds. We never will know who put the hold on the bill, but you should know, by the way, the hold probably had nothing to do with this bill. It probably was caught in a melange of other holds. To its credit, the Senate has gotten rid of those. But we were trying to avoid exactly what we have here. A vacancy has been created in the council because a member had to resign because of misconduct. We tried, and the chairman worked with me, to make sure that perhaps this election could be held on April 3rd, when we're having a primary anyway. Could not happen. Just could not happen because of the time it takes for people to get to know there's a vacancy, because of the time it takes for the public to know what is happening whenever you have an election. As a result of what the Senate did, not this committee, the District of Columbia is going to have to pay more than $300,000 to have a special election in May, when we could have had this matter before us at the April primary. Unnecessary costs, extra harm, actual harm that this committee tried to forego. What's before you, what's before you simply reduces the number of days during which a vacancy can lie. It was very specific in the charter. First Tuesday, occurring more than 114 days after a vacancy. What the bill that the chairman and I worked on, together with the District of Columbia, gives the district some latitude, understands that there will be circumstances, for example, religious. What do you do if there's a religious holiday? We had that to arise. And there was anger that there was nothing we could do about the fact that an election had to be held when it was at that time, a special election, even though there was a Jewish holiday. We just had to go ahead and do it. We could have done something had the bill before us now been in force then. Mr. Chairman, I would like to work with you on such charter matters to see whether or not we could agree that things like this wouldn't have to take up even 5 minutes of this committee's time. They're all procedural and structural. I've never found one that was of any consequence or that anyone in the committee or in the Congress cared about. And Mr. Chairman, I think we could do that. And one of the reasons I believe we could do that is that you have taken the initiative on a matter that is far more consequential, but also a matter that it could be argued was entirely a District of Columbia matter. In your budget autonomy bill, would in fact cure palpable harm, the harm of schools opening after the House passes its bill the harm of a premium being charged the district on Wall Street, the harm of operational problems. And after listening to that harm, you did something that was very unusual. On the spot, you believe that there could be a better way than simply having this local budget, which is always passed with almost no oversight over what the actual numbers are, that something probably could be done. And I appreciate that if you said that on something far more serious, although also entirely local, we should move ahead, that gives me confidence to believe that on these minor matters we might also make considerable headway. So I thank you for your considerable help on this bill. It won't help this election, but it means that in the foreseeable future, and we never know what the future will bring, at least this committee and hopefully the House will have done its job as we did the last time. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Would the gentlelady yield?
I'll be pleased to yield to the Chairman.
Just briefly on your time, thank you for your comments. And I come from a place where $300,000 wasted is never too small for anyone's attention. So although you know, we're going to dispense with this in that 5 minutes, the fact is we need to find more of those, and this committee should never be too busy to move legislation, particularly non-controversial legislation like this is becoming, in order to allow greater autonomy and cost savings for any part of the Federal Government, but particularly for our Federal city that you so ably represent. So I thank the gentlelady and yield back. Thank you. I will hold the record open until the end of the day. The members may submit their written statements. Believe it or not, the bill is now opened, H.R. 3902, for consideration, and without objection, H.R. 3902 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed to in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3902, a bill to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to revise the timing of special elections for a local office in the District of Columbia.
I thank you. Presuming that no one else has further comment on this, I will skip and no amendments. If there is no further discussion, I move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 3902 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill. Without objection, the motion and unanimous consent are agreed to. So ordered. I now ask unanimous consent the committee favorably report the following postal naming bills en bloc: H.R. 3276, H.R. 3378, H.R. 3412, H.R. 3413, H.R. 3477, H.R. 3501, H.R. 3593, H.R. 3637, H.R. 3772, H.R. 3869, H.R. 3870, and H.R. 3892. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Was I off that whole time? Oh, good. Okay. We now return to H.R. 3813, in which votes, or in which we had recessed and in which we had rolled votes. If there is no further discussion, if there's no further discussion, we now return to amendments previously rolled. We now first call up the Lynch amendment, in which a recorded vote was asked, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Burton? No. Mr. Burton votes no. Mr. Mica? Mr. Platts? Mr. Platts votes yes. Mr. Turner? Mr. McHenry?
The gentlelady will suspend. I apologize. Weren't there two Lynch?
This is Lynch 046. No, we only had one Lynch rolled vote.
One was accepted, I believe.
And the other one's agreed to. So this is the first Lynch. My no stands. Go ahead.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Mack? Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Ms. Burkle? Ms. Burkle votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Ginta, Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Ginta? Mr. Ginta votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Mr. Towns? Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes yes. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes yes. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes yes. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes yes. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes yes. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes yes. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes yes. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes yes. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes yes.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Turner, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Turner votes no.
The gentleman is not recorded.
You are not recorded, sir. You're not recorded.
The gentleman from Florida wishes to vote no. Is that correct? Yes, you're going to vote no?
Mr. Micah votes no.
The gentleman from New York.
No, I'm a yes.
Mr. Towns votes yes. Mr. Cooper.
The clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there are 14 yeses. I'm sorry, 17 yeses, 21 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. We now call up the Davis amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Burton? Mr. Burton votes no. Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes no. Mr. Platts? Mr. Platts votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Mack? Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Ms. Burkle? Ms. Burkle votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Ginta? Mr. Ginta votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Mr. Towns? Mr. Towns votes yes. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes yes. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes no. Yes. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes yes. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes yes. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes yes. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes yes. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes yes. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes yes.
The clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, 15 yeses, 22 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. We now call up the Kucinich amendment. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Burton? Mr. Burton votes no. Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes no. Mr. Platts? Mr. Platts votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Mack? Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes no. Ms. Burkle? Ms. Burkle votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Ginta? Mr. Ginta votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes yes. Mr. Towns? Mr. Towns votes yes. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes yes. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes yes. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Tierney? Mr. Kucinich, I didn't get your vote. I'm sorry. Mr. Kucinich votes yes. Mr. Tierney votes yes. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes yes. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes yes. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes yes. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes yes. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes yes. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes yes. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes yes. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes yes. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes yes.
The clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, 15 yeses, 22 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. If there is no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment in nature of substitute. All those in favor say aye. With a little more excitement. All those opposed, no. No. See? In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. You know, New England was more excited, too. I hereby move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, boy, I knew I was in trouble there, on Government Reform report, yeah, I know to New York I am, report the bill H.R. 3813 to the House with the recommendation to do pass. All those in favor, and this time with gusto, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. Clearly, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. And with that, there is a requested roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Burton? Aye. Mr. Burton votes aye. Mr. Micah? Mr. Micah votes aye. Mr. Platts? Mr. Platts votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Mack? Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes aye. Ms. Burkle? Ms. Burkle votes aye. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan votes aye. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh votes aye. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Ginta? Mr. Ginta votes aye. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Mr. Towns? Mr. Towns votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes no. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no.
The clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, 22 ayes, 16 noes.
And the amendment, the motion is agreed to, H.R. 3813 is ordered reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. And unanimous consent is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from Florida?
Mr. Chairman, I request the number of days to submit views.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2L of the House Rule number 11, as for additional calendar days, 2 additional calendar days to file minority views on H.R. 3813.
So ordered. Okay. That's all right. That's all right. It all works. As we conclude, Mr. Ross, always be aware the ranking member always says it better. It's part of seniority. I'd like to thank all the members of the majority and minority for an effective markup today and for your attendance. With that, we stand adjourned.